Tonight I'm going to welcome Barrie Bardoe, and he's an information warfare specialist. And I'm very excited about this because I don't know a lot about the topic. And what he's mentioned to me last Tuesday when we had a little chat, it's really made me think about how we are dealt information and what we're expected to do with it as a community and how it affects our lives. So welcome, Barrie. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Could we start off by you telling us a bit about yourself and how you came to get into this profession?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start off by a little disclaimer that anything I talk about tonight is very much my own personal views, the result of my own personal research. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any person I've ever worked for or anything like that. And we will talk about purely public domain examples. But I suppose the term information warfare is fairly loaded. So I'm going to start with the definition of that, which will explain a little bit about what I do and what my background is. According to 9Jul from the National Defense University in the US, information warfare is, if I may look at my notes, conflict or struggle between two or more groups in the information environment. So I got involved with, and that can take in a big range of things from, you know, PR to marketing to disinformation. I got involved many, many years ago in marketing and PR and professional writing and analysis and all those sorts of things, and have since worked for government, military, political and private concerns.
So a broad range of experience there.
Yeah, there is, and I maintain a fairly broad palette. I'm currently doing postgraduate research, and I've written a book called The Secrets of How You're Being Manipulated and the Power to Fight Back. It's not out yet, but that will hopefully step people through. So if at the end of this anyone's still a bit confused or whatever, there's other things they can go and read, because it's a lot to get your mind around.
All right, thank you. Let's start with what is information warfare and why is it so important that people know about it and what effects it can have?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the term warfare is so loaded, isn't it? But you hear it particularly, you know, in the corporate, I mean, we all know about conventional warfare, but you hear about it a lot in the corporate context, people talking about quite, you know, warfare related analogies and how they go about things. And basically, we live in an age where there's more information sources, more information platforms. I think something like 90% of the data in the world now popped up in the last 10 years. So we are being deluged with information, and that is being used to achieve changes to policy, people's attitudes, et cetera, et cetera. And it really is warfare in the sense that you can use it in a military context, obviously, but corporates and private interests and various other non-state actors, as they like to say, use this very, very effectively.
So, well, who does use it that would affect me, for instance, or someone watching? How would it be used in the context of just everyday life for people? All
right, well, I'm trying to popularise a variation which I call ambient warfare. And what I mean by that is not just information, but the entire lived environment. And I'll put it to you that every single decision that people are currently making is the result of that ubiquitous environment that we inhabit, all these different information sources. And there are people who are very good at this job out there who are making sure that policy, the media, and mainstream opinion fall in step with their particular goals, and they can be very varied.
So does that mean that the media are told what they can tell the public? I mean, is it that controlled?
Look, I mean, that's a very, very explicit analysis. And I think there's times when journalists will tell you, look, I was sort of told to back off from a particular topic, whatever, but it's far more subtle, it's far more nuanced, and it is to do with shaping an entire worldview. So, you know, some journalists have a worldview they've grown up with, which has been shaped, which in turn can be leveraged for particular uses, names. A lot of time, I'm sure they're either not conscious of it, or the big problem these days with the speed of the turnover of information is they just don't have time for in-depth journalism anymore. It's a real problem. And you've got to finish that point, you've got to remember that media outlets are generally businesses. They don't want to piss off, you know, their various different corporate interests, I suppose. So they've got to be a little bit careful. There's some things where they can be merciless, and there's other things where I know from being in the industry a long time, you've got to be a bit cautious.
Okay. Okay. And you did mention the use of neuroscience when we had a chat the other night. Can you tell me where that fits into this? Yeah,
look, if I could just do a quick bit of history, this whole toolkit goes back, was probably perfected by Dr. Joseph Goebbels in National Socialist Germany in the 30s. And he took his cues from British propaganda in First World War, but he also went to corporate America and he saw how they used catchy slogans to influence and make sure people buy their products or have certain attitudes and values. So I'm going to ask you a question in turn. Why do women shave their armpits? It is I'll answer that question. I mean, most people don't think about that, but in the early part of the 20th century, a certain company that is ubiquitous with shaving products started a campaign using the media of the day to shame women into shaving. And within 20 years, they doubled their market share, and 90% of women in Western countries were shaving under their armpits. They never used to do that. That was the first really successful corporate information and marketing campaign, and it's changed societal values. So if you look at that, I think that was just done with print media. You have a think now about what they've got and how they can change an entire set of cultural assumptions.
That's quite scary when you look at it like that, because yeah, I mean, a whole society can be manipulated.
Yeah, and Goebbels realised that he had the new media of the day. He had radio and film, and he wanted this should shock people a little bit, but he wanted everybody to have a cheap radio. Now, can you think of something else now that is pretty much the single point of information for absolutely everybody in society? By controlling the point of information, you control the narrative. But the neuroscience thing, he realised very early on, there's a thing called cognitive ease, and it's very, very simple. You can be as intelligent as you like, but if you hear something repeated again and again by an authoritative source, you begin to believe it, even if it's completely illogical or against your values or whatever. And it actually bypasses critical thinking, and it's a well-established tactic. So his thing was, you have an authoritative source and you repeat it again and again and again, and you know, Europe's most progressive country will suddenly go, hey, let's follow a genocidal maniac to oblivion. You know, it makes people do crazy illogical things.
Yeah, okay. So if repeated messages, which we get from our iPhone, from television and so on, it's almost like, could I use the word brainwashing?
Yeah, why not? That's exactly what it is. Absolutely.
Okay. So we're all a mob of brainwashed people running around, jumping up and down about things that may or may not be true.
Worse than that, people who are very, very good at this job in the corporate world will find things that we normal, nice, reasonable people would consider good, and they will piggyback their agenda on the back of that. So you'll be accepting something most people would accept as being a good thing, but their agenda is embedded within that. So it achieves an end that suits their purposes whilst making you feel good about your values. That's the trick.
Okay. Do you have an example of what that would look like?
Yes,
or an
I
issue?
do. Pretty much anything you can think of. I mean, I would put it to you that most people understand what's meant by the term Big Australia. That is, you know, high immigration figures, all that sort of stuff. Most good, reasonable people like the idea of diversity. They like the idea of inclusiveness. They like the idea of Australia participating in world culture. But I put it to you, And I think the Age newspaper ran quite a good article on this recently, that the development lobby has leveraged off this to create huge demand for their services, so that we now are basically an infrastructure-based economy. 1 in 11 jobs are based in construction. It's great for creating jobs, etc., but it also means because there's so much demand, they can bump up the prices as much as they like. So we now have the highest house prices of any Western country. I'm not saying that that's necessarily completely a cohesive and deliberate thing, but it suits a different agenda. That's an example. There's plenty more.
Okay, yeah. So corporations use it. Politicians use this as well?
Oh yes, but I think there's varying degrees of expertise. I mean, I'll give you a really good example. You know, one of the masters, as we've seen. I mean, who would have thought that a reality TV star could become a president? But anyway, he seems to have done it. And he gave a speech where, Donald Trump gave a speech where he'd done a debate. I think it was in the Republican, you know, lead off to choosing their candidate. And he said something along the lines of how he'd won the debate, I think 11 times in 17 seconds. And even someone like me, who's, you know, fairly used to this sort of stuff, at the end was associating win, Trump, win, Trump. It's that simple sometimes, that if you hear something again and again, you sort of walk away going, oh yeah, I think you won that, you know. But it's generally much more subtle, and it works a lot better if you approach it from a whole lot of different angles. Like if you have a whole lot of different information platforms saying a similar-ish thing, you start to just accept it, and you have to really take a step back and go, is that actually what I believe or is true or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I'm finding it very difficult to decipher truth from fiction in a lot of what's happening today. Like if we can talk about the lockdowns and to me, none of this makes sense, because I don't see pandemic numbers happening. Not to say it's not a real virus and it's not happening, but the way everybody is just simply falling into line, and a very few people are questioning it. Everybody's, you know, got their masks and they're staying home. They're doing what they're told without question. And to me, I just think, how does a whole huge society behave that way? Why does that happen?
That's a really interesting question that speaks of the power of this. And I'll put a disclaimer in front of this that, like you, I'm not suggesting that it's not a thing. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, you shouldn't behave responsibly or any of those sorts of things. Let's just talk about the mechanism rather than the actual thing itself. I had a conversation with a colleague, I think the end of last year, and we're just sort of talking about how long would it take to change society beyond recognition if you set yourself the goal of doing it. And in National Socialist Germany, I think Triumph of the Will was filmed in 1934. They only had a year, and by the end of a year, it's like it was unrecognizable to what had preceded it. So that was an amazing job back then with the technology of the day. But as you see, we have now all decided on a very different way of living, or accepted a very different way of living, based upon the fact that authority figures have come out and said this is how it is, and everybody in the media and everybody has basically agreed. Now, whether that's right or wrong is not what I'm going to debate. It's just a matter, you can see these mechanisms, when it comes from enough angles, people will accept it. That's the extent of my point.
Okay. So, yeah, well, from a corporate perspective then, if you're wanting to sell a product, it must be quite easy, actually. A bit of advertising, repeated advertising, because, I mean, I know we don't watch much commercial television, but we do watch the football. And every time there's an ad, it's the same ad, it's the same ad, it's the same ad. And I guess that's a part of it, isn't it?
That these days is almost a smokescreen, because we're very, very used to identifying explicit advertising, and most consumers are pretty exhausted by it, but they do it so that you can see, so you can almost say to yourself, hey, I'm not being tricked, I can spot the advertising. What influences you are subtle things embedded in the overall information landscape. Like, for example, I had a corporate client years ago, and we set up countless authoritative looking websites which had discussion of things which in turn would lead towards their desired outcome. And there's an example of an election where there's a site that sort of asked you all these questions and told you which party most closely aligned with your values. And coincidentally or not, this same party was always the result. I can't think of the exact example, but things like that, which funnel from multiple sources. So you go, I'm too smart, I don't fall for advertising. But meanwhile, your entire landscape of information has been tampered with.
So, well, manipulation, isn't it? It's almost hypnotic, really, isn't it? You come to a point of belief even if you don't believe it.
Absolutely, and it is very, very powerful. And the other thing that's very, very powerful, like cognitive ease, is incredible. You know, if you do that effectively, it is amazing. You get the smartest people on earth, and they'll be believing a slogan, absolutely, and that becomes their values. But a really good example, you know, when you think of in and out group theory, if you utilize that properly, if you make the in group fearful and you have a credible out group and you project all of that fear onto them, it enhances the in group narrative exponentially. And anyone who's really good at this needs an out group. They need a little group that you can vilify and make to look stupid and hated. And that massively increases the power of their narrative. And just to quickly go back to 1930s Germany, you know, there was, in the 30s, there were Jewish Germans who'd fought loyally in the First World War, had iron crosses and things like that. And here they are being herded into camps. And they're obviously thinking, how could this possibly be happening? And from a logical point of view, they could not pose any security threat to Germany whatsoever. They were loyal Germans through and through, and this is happening, and you know, people couldn't get their minds around it, and to think that we are suddenly immune from that would be very naive.
So you see that happening now in yes. A communal way, a community?
Yeah, and look, I would refrain from saying that it's a big mistake is to see these things as monoliths, like, you know, one particular entity is controlling the whole narrative. There's lots of competing narratives and there's lots of in-out group dynamics. So it can get, it's very messy. The whole environment is extremely messy.
So who sits at the top of all this? I guess in a corporate world, it's the boss. And in a government world, it's the ministers. But I mean, I guess I'm confused as to how who decides what it is and where it goes. That's probably sounds a bit of a silly question, but sorry.
Well, I think it very much depends who you're talking about, because if you're talking about a corporate entity, I know from experience that often the marketing department, like I know one cutting edge marketing concern that do predictive marketing and stuff you wouldn't believe. Like, they know what you're going to do before you even decide it. It's absolutely incredible. And they will work for different clients, and the client might go, it might be as simple as we want them to buy X product, or it might be we want them in general to, you know, accept this range of things, or it might be something far more nebulous, but the client will drive it. And in my experience in some of the corporate entities, the marketing department, say the science department, the law department, they're not necessarily on the same page at all. You know, so it's not as simple as a person decides and then it all unfolds. It can be very messy and complicated.
Gosh, it's I mean, I guess I feel just for myself, I feel like I've just been conned my whole life. You know, I'm nearly 70, and I sort of think, what decisions have I made that have actually been my decisions? I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And it's a really good exercise for the viewers tonight to take a step back. And I defy you to come up with what you think is your most heart-held value and belief, and ask yourself that question. And look, it could be that you've been a bit manipulated into a point of view that nonetheless is a really good, valid, wholesome position to be in. I mean, you know, there's people who market renewable energy in a fairly to my mind, manipulative manner. All advertising manipulates to some degree. You know, your desire to do good can be a source of manipulation as well. But it's a really interesting exercise to step back and go, you know, what do I believe and where did that idea come from?
Yeah, because you'd have also obviously your family history, what you grew up with and the values they had that you continue on with. And then you've got all the external factors that add to that. So it's very complex, isn't it? How we end up where we are.
Yeah, and I think, you know, leftist philosopher Louis Althusser talked about how he never really thought that he had any real original scope for your own thinking. It was either the state or what you've described, your cultural environment informed what you thought pretty much all the time. And you have to really consciously deconstruct that and step back and analyze your position, because there are millions of competing interests trying to guide people in certain directions. And the really explicit stuff like, you know, stay at home, blah, 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 I think most people can see that that's explicit, but there's a million more subtle things in a million different topic areas. And there's groups like, you know, in the US election, like the alt-right, who were incredibly good at co-opting the mainstream narrative and turning it back on itself. And they used counterintuitive things, like they had the little cartoon frog. And the more the mainstream didn't understand it, the more it reinforced the narrative that the mainstream's out of touch and doesn't really get things anymore. And the mainstream media is obsolete. And there's one very mainstream journalist who made the mistake of tweeting, you know, what's going on with Pepe the Frog? What is this? And straight off was just ridiculed beyond belief by thousands of people on the internet, because he obviously didn't get it. And the whole point is it's not something to be got. And that's the counterintuitive thing. If you put things out there that people struggle to understand, then straight off, you know, you're making the mainstream look silly. So that was a tactic they used that was very counterintuitive, but very, very effective. So it doesn't have to be just, you know, mindless repetition of slogans, although that does work.
Okay, so what are the implications for a society where discussions on certain topics are considered dangerous? How does the techniques of the neuroscience or the bypassing critical thinking, how does that fit in with, well, topics that we really aren't meant to discuss?
Yeah, look, there's certain topics, and I'm sure we both know what we're alluding to, but there are a range of topics now where if you were to bring them up and just request a rational discussion about them, you'll be horrendously vilified. And once again, to go back to the 1930s thing, you can imagine some German Jew with his iron cross saying, hey, you know, I want to participate in the social narrative, and suddenly you're the worst person on earth through no fault of your own. And I think you'll find that most of those things are very, very deliberate information warfare campaigns, which are designed to create an outgroup that everybody else can fear and hate, and thus increase their narrative. And they spend a lot of time discrediting people who might interrupt that process.
So it becomes an agenda to focus on for certain groups, I suppose, that have a vested interest in a certain outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, wherever there's billions of dollars involved, you can bet some of this is going on. And there's, you know, so many different examples. I mean, ISIS have been brilliant at upending the dominant Western narrative, not on the battlefield so much, but certainly in the internet. You know, they've done an amazing job. And what people don't see is, you know, they hear about the violent stuff they upload, but they upload a lot of other stuff that's very, very clever that really questions, you know, the West's moral superiority. So there's that sort of side of it you can do really, really cleverly. But the corporate interests try to control the information environment as much as possible. So they control the first page of a Google search, and therefore 95% of searches. If people are contrarians, if they're really well-credentialed people, they'll destroy the credibility of their qualifications. Even absurd things where an entire university is, you know, supposedly not valid because a particular academic questions their point of view. These sorts of tactics, it's not just one thing. It's very complicated, and they're very, very good, as I described, at setting up seemingly authoritative bodies and websites and advocacy groups, which are really just fronts. And yeah, there's some fantastic information about that. So when you do a search and you find these websites that sort of seem to very solidly support a particular thing, often it's just, you know, it's just information warfare. It's just a front.
So, but you'd have no way of knowing that, would you? So you could go on believing everything that's on that website.
American journalist Cheryl Atkinson talks about astroturfing, which is the creation of a completely believable but fake grassroots movement to give the idea there's ubiquitous support for certain things. And of course, you know, she picks on our good friends in the pharmaceutical industry with that, but she's actually listed a whole bunch of websites which she believes are astroturfing websites. And, you know, she's come out, she's done a lot of research on it, and whether or not she's spot on with all of them, I think there's certainly an awful lot. It's hard, like you say, it'd be impossible to nail down all of them, but if you can maintain that first page of a Google search, you pretty much own the information landscape, and that's a pretty incredible thought.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? We all rely on Mr. Google or Dr. Google.
That's not meant to do that.
People do it.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Barrie, I've had friends say, trust the experts, the majority experts. And if any expert deviates from the dominant narrative, ignore them. And questioning majority experts is foolish and narcissistic. So what makes someone give away their critical thinking?
Yeah, this trust the majority is a really interesting idea, because once again, if you're very good at astroturfing, you can create the illusion of a majority relatively easily. You have to also look at several different factors. Firstly, are people financially benefiting? Are they in a situation where their career is in some way likely to be compromised by deviating? And then if someone does deviate, do they have anything to gain? Are they well credentialed? And most often, if they've got a lot to lose, that may not mean that what they're saying is necessarily true, but it does add a bit of gravitas to it. So you need to look at those factors, because, you know, people talk about scientific consensus. Well, Albert Einstein got a letter from 100 colleagues saying, back off relativity theory, it's insane and crazy, you're making us look stupid. Science, you know, particularly is not about consensus. It is about, more often than not, individuals making innovative, new look at things. And it's amazing how many things are predicated upon assumptions that we now take as being, you know, empirically tested. And they are actually assumptions. And without getting controversial, I mean, archaeology for a long, long time, and that's part of my background, was pushing this idea that glaciers pushed deposits up mountains, which explained for why you would say have fish skeletons, you know, on top of a mountain in a certain time period or whatever, because archaeologists wanted to be scientific. They didn't want to buy into what they saw as a biblical religious narrative with this idea of a flood and all that stuff. And glaciologists will tell you glaciers behave very, very differently. But for 150 years, that was the orthodoxy, and no one tested it. I can think of other orthodoxies that nobody tests.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what's the difference between someone who questions dominant narratives and one who doesn't?
They threw me with that question, because it's a good question, but I guess it's just, do you want to have an individual worldview and be prepared to be wrong and all of the stuff that goes with it, or do you just want to go along with what you're told to do? And if you had utter faith that every single aspect of policy and regulation and corporate interests were all acting in your best interests, that would be fine. If you doubt that, you should start doing a bit of questioning, yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. And I think what I see, I certainly see a lot more people now are, I call it awake, because they're questioning what's going on, and certainly the trust of governments is less than it used to be. We question their motives of why they do things now. So I guess that there's probably I think, a lot more people starting to wake up and question things. So is part of the strategy to manipulate people so they can, like, unwittingly go and manipulate their own family? So, you know, if I and friends, so we carry it on. We carry on whatever it is.
It's, I think, you know, who was it, Lennon, who coined the term useful idiots. And if you can, and in marketing, like in corporate marketing, if you can make someone go and do the marketing for you and not pay them, that's a better outcome. And the useful idiot idea is you create a mindset where people accept your values and assumptions, and then they go and do all the hard work for you. And that's why it's so hard to prove explicit connections with some of this stuff, because people are doing it for free off their own bat. And that's what, to me, is, you know, is quite incredible. Just to cover off on that thing with politicians before, I would say that, you know, my experience of politicians is there's undoubtedly some great ones out there that are in it for the right reasons. It is the hardest job on earth, and you've got to be an expert at absolutely everything. You are reliant upon the people advising you, and they do get it wrong. And I think now there's, you know, we expect our politicians to be perfect, and part of the thing they're dealing with is a feedback loop with social media where, you know, people are so hysterical about things and so unthinking, and in turn politicians are put in a really tricky situation where they've got to be seen to be doing something. And I don't know, I think it all feeds, it's reaching this sort of critical mass of all feeding off each other so quickly that it's really, really hard to take the time you need to step back and go, this is good policy, or, you know, this piece of research requires another week, because everything's turning over in such quick timings. Yeah, it's very confusing times, and
it is confusing times. Yeah. It is a confusing time. I mean, right now we're in times that are changing every day, and we'll probably never quite go back to what we had before. Whether that's good or bad, we won't know until we move through it. But I think that this is the most confusing time I've certainly ever seen in my lifetime.
Absolutely.
And it's quite unsettling, I guess, is a word I would think, what we're living through now. And I think people are wanting directive, they're wanting security, they want to know they'll be okay. And
that's not life, though, is it?
That's not life. That's not life.
And I think you make a really good point there, that part of the problem, and you see this on social media, is people now have an almost, I mean, I was talking to my doctor the other day about all of this, and he said, you know, people now you know, have this expectation that they'll be completely safe all the time, and everything's about managing risk. Like, you know, 400 people died in the last year in Victoria on the roads, or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but a lot. And you know, when you go on the roads, you are managing risk. Everything you do is about risk, and we'll all die and all those sorts of things. But I think now there's this expectation, and a lot of these, particularly corporate interests, really push this idea that, you know, we'll offer you complete assurance and safety, and you won't have to do anything. You can be lazy and we'll take care of it all. That culture is a real problem. The other thing is disinformation. Now, if you're really good at information warfare and you want to discredit people who are causing you trouble, you'll chuck disinformation in there that by association will make them look ridiculous. And that's the problem too. A lot of people who, as you put it, are sort of waking up, are starting to also go, well, if we've been lied to about this, then we've been lied to about every other thing. Good information warfare has quite a lot of truth in it. So you have truth, but then you put your little agendas in amongst the truth. So discerning all of that, you know, I implore people to really critically think about what they're accepting during the waking up process as well.
It's really tricky. It's really tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's some, you know, if money's involved, if billions of dollars are involved, you can bet that somebody is pretty keen to continue making that kind of money. If something, you know, my experience certainly is when people come up with complex conspiracies involving agencies from all these different countries, I can't buy into that, because I know that, well, I don't want to disparage any government agency, but it is complicated coordinating things on a much lower level, let alone that. And these days, as Edward Snowden showed, just all you need is a memory stick and you lose security. So the more people you've got involved, the harder it is. So something really, really complicated that doesn't have any sort of real logical imperative is very, very difficult, I would imagine, these days. But when there's billions of dollars involved and you've got a really good marketing department and really good lawyers, you just keep at it and spend the money and reap the results, I think.
Yes, and make people want what you're going to give them.
Yeah, even if it's not good for them, and even if it makes no logical sense, and particularly get them fearful. Fear is a fantastic motivator. And, once again, going to the present situation, people are beside themselves with fear. And, realistically, for the average person, they don't need to be that fearful. By all means do, whatever they perceive the right thing to be. But, they don't need to be beside themselves, sick with fear. And I know people now who are probably going to wind up very ill because moment by moment they're terrified of what's going on.
Yeah, I agree, and quite paranoid with it. They, wiping their hands every second, and it's fear is a great controller, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask you, Barry, what are your thoughts on social media farms? What does that mean to you?
Social media, I missed the last bit.
This is a question from a viewer. Social media farms. I haven't heard of.
They would need to clarify their terms there. I could guess at what they mean, but I'd need a bit more information for that, I think.
Okay. No, well, I haven't heard of it, but social media farms. Okay. Send another message, whoever sent that in, and we'll see if we can clear it up.
Just clarify your terms of reference, because I don't want to talk about something where I'm not 100% clear what you mean by that. I've heard that expression, but get them to clarify.
Okay, all right. Okay, another one is, are there any tips to empower us to discern the fake news or information from the truth? Well, that's what we've been talking about. But do you have any tips that would allow us more easily to discern what's true?
I would, I think verification is the challenge of our times. As Cheryl Atkinson said, it is the biggest challenge. And in my book, which will be out soon, I will step you through it. It's not easy. I don't pretend as much. But the first step is to see if there is something to be gained from a particular thing, particularly financial gain. If you get a bunch of people, like one of the big problems of our times is key opinion leaders. They are people who have authority, who stand to benefit from a particular thing, who speak very highly of it in public again and again. And because they are well credentialed and are smart people and well qualified, they are believed. And I think it was Tom Jefferson, the Cochrane collaboration, wrote an article about it in the Conversation a while back. He said the problem is that they get undue influence and they form a bit, relationship with marketing where their career benefits, and then they say the thing that the marketers want, and it builds upon itself. So if it's someone like you suspect of being like that who has personal gain, obviously you need to question that. You need to go back to primary sources. People need to stop being lazy. They need to stop reading one sentence and jumping to conclusions. They need to look and see if something is clearly disinformation. Like if something has no real point to it other than to make an issue unnecessarily complex, or it involves a theory that is unprovable, put your attention where you can actually establish facts. Don't just go with the first 12 pages, first 12 entries on Google, things like that. And it doesn't hurt to study a little bit of academic research techniques, whilst realizing that academia also has very, very high levels of self-censorship, I suppose you could say diplomatically.
Okay. All right. They're good tips. So I just want to ask you about your book. When would that be likely to come out? Because I'm finding this a very interesting topic, and I don't know a lot about it personally, but I would certainly like to know more and be able to be a little more discerning in in how I make my beliefs or my choices around what I'm hearing, to find the truth. So tell me, when is this book coming?
I've finished the draft of it, and I was going to go through conventional publishing, but I've decided to whack it online because that's the spirit of the age. And I'm hoping the last quarter of the year should be before the end of the year, hopefully, if all things go to plan. And maybe we can catch up again and sort of talk about it when it is available.
Definitely.
Yeah, that would be good. And I've written it in a way where a completely non-expert person can step through it, see the history of it, how it works, and then give them a toolkit so that they can go away and have a chance.
Yeah, I'd like a chance. I'd definitely like a chance. Because this sounds like you're talking about from the 1930s. I mean, this isn't new. This is something that's obviously been used, well, close to 100 years to manipulate the populace, really.
I would suggest to you that 5,000 years ago, someone was writing on a papyrus that Ramesses II is not a god. This stuff's been going on a very long time. And like I said, the National Socialists in Germany, they got their cues off British propaganda in World War I. And there's instances of propaganda throughout history. The difference now is you've got a deluge of information from so many different sources, and you've got people who have spent a lot of time studying the neuroscience behind it. So it's much more nuanced, it's much more clever, it's much more ambient.
Okay, yeah. All right. Barrie, I've just had information from this person. It said, the farms are a number of fake social media accounts promoting an agenda by distributing fake news.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's probably different terminology I might use for that. That falls under astroturfing, and it's more than a thing. I mean, I one of my triumphs for a corporate client was getting a journalist to plagiarize some material that I'd put in an authoritative sounding website and pass it off as being authoritative material, and it was just copy. And you see that happening all the time. And the more support is seen for a particular position from the more diverse range of platforms, the more support it seems to have. So if you get on social media and you think everybody supports this particular thing, you get on Google, you see first 12 entries are all supporting it, 99% of people are likely to go, well, this has ubiquitous support. It's really, the battle for that first page on Google and social media is literally warfare. It is people. There's a lot of articles now, people talking about the weaponization of social media and memes, and depending on your perspective, people are either right or wrong. But there's trillions of fake grassroots things going on in social media, which even makes it even more complicated. So yeah, I thought that's what they were getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, it's enormously complex, and I don't know, I guess I feel a bit I've been had all these years.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I would exhort people to is it's okay to be wrong. There's a few things where I look back, maybe an article I wrote 4, 5, 6, 10 years ago, and I go, oh, I cringe, or I've changed my perspective, or I've got new information. That's totally cool. And I think what they exploit is people who are inflexible. Like once you got someone on board, they just won't incorporate a new idea or new information. And that's a very interesting human foible. Can I just quickly talk about, I reckon, the best slogan I've heard for a long, long time, Make America Great Again. Now that is brilliant because humans have a natural desire to romanticize the past, which is why folk music exists. The past was always better. So he's not only tuned in on this American desire to be great, but he also tuned in on this whole romanticization of this mythical past that probably never existed in the first place. But that's regardless of what you think of the president, that is genius sloganeering. And corporate interests are incredibly good at these 4 or 5 letter words, slogans that just resonate with people, you know, and it becomes their belief and their worldview. That's genius when you achieve something like that.
Mm. It is, yeah. And I guess just going back to the last point is that if you see, like on Google, the first 12 points all say the same thing, the first 12 little sites. And I think people want to be part of a tribe. They want to be in the accepted, the in-group. So from that perspective, maybe it's even easier to manipulate or to get people to think in a certain way because they want to be accepted.
Absolutely, and that's the in-out group theory stuff. And people love to be part of that. You'll notice something like, regardless of what you think of, you know, some of these topic areas, you'll notice that often you'll hear a statistic like 97%, you know, agree with a particular thing. You hear that figure, or high 90s, a lot. Now, the idea behind that is it shows an overwhelming majority support for something, but it gives a little pressure valve for those few naughty people who disagree. So if someone comes up who's well-credentialed, who disagrees, and go, oh, they're just part of that tiny percentage, and you've explained them away really quickly and easily while still holding the majority perspective. If you were to claim 100%, the second someone dissents, you look stupid. So you notice a lot of the time on an issue, there'll be this claim of, you know, 90+% of people.
Yeah, I have seen that. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Quite deliberate.
You've got deliberate, yeah. Manipulative. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, just another question coming in. Well, again, just saying how they're so distressed that they feel that there's, you know, so much disinformation out there that they've not necessarily made a good choice around their stance. So, but, you know, you said you can be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. Get new information and see where it sits for you, isn't it? Look deeper, dig deeper into things.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we were talking about before, that there is an expectation now that you'll be perfectly safe and you'll be perfectly protected all the time. And life is about challenges, mistakes, things not turning out the way you want. And, you know, one of those, you know, very successful people, I forget who it was, said that, you know, success is built upon multiple mistakes that you've learnt from. So if you've got the humility to turn around and go, oh, in the light of this better credentialed information from someone who's, you know, not in the pay of whoever or whatever your perspective is, if you have the humility to then go, well, this information is probably of higher quality than what I previously was buying into, that's all part of progressing. But I don't think there's a single person in the world who would have a completely clean slate for perfect information, because it's not out there anymore. And I don't know who would. And I think even people at the top of corporations are getting disinformation from other corporations, and you know, certainly out in, you know, the situation with, you know, groups like ISIS or the alt-right or any of those, they're feeding so much disinformation in there, and various governments are, and it's an absolute quagmire. And I think I read recently that I think, you know, the Pentagon's fielding 800 cyber attacks a week, and a deluge of information that may or may not be reliable that they have to sift through. And that's overwhelming. So it is very, very hard. And I think people have to release this idea that they're going to have this completely pure, uncluttered worldview. It will be evolving all the time. And I think you have to have that attitude. It's always a work in progress.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. I've just got another question. Have you heard of Nesara Gesara? I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, Nesara Gesara. And is there any truth to it? Do you know what I'm talking about? Because I haven't heard of it.
Oh, no, you got me on that one. There's a lot of very arcane stuff out there. I was in the company of someone who was hitting me with a whole lot of stuff the other day. And part of me is thinking, oh, this is disinformation. The other part's thinking, I need to go and check on some of this stuff. I don't profess to be across, you know, every sort of issue on the internet, but I am, you know, very familiar with how you get an agenda accepted.
Okay, yeah, it's really interesting. I'd certainly like to learn more about it, that's for sure. It's quite fascinating. Okay, Barrie, is there any last little message you can give to our viewers?
Yeah, I suppose just to reiterate that last point, don't give up. Embrace verification as much as you can, as difficult as that is now. Be, you know, rationally skeptical whilst open-minded. There's a lovely balance there. And, you know, any advance in science has always, you know, trod that line. And be humble, you know, and I think there's a lot of people in the conspiracy theory world who, it's almost like an arms race, and they become special because they propose something more outlandish than the next person. Don't be that guy. Be the person who actually goes, well, perhaps this isn't right, or this is, and have that humility. And understand that the mainstream news is best described as news entertainment. So there will be truth in there. There'll be stuff that's inflamed. There'll be stuff that's advertorial. Lots and lots of sport. You know, remain open-minded but critical.
Okay, remain open-minded but critical. I like that. Thank you. Barrie, thank you for joining us tonight. I've really enjoyed the talk, and I hope we can do this again, because I think you've got probably a lot more to share. And perhaps as we get closer to your book being available, we could have another discussion. Yeah,
look, I'd love that. And I think, as you say, there's so much to cover that it'd be really good to refer people to say, look, here's this document that's written in very, very simple, easy to understand terms. It'll step you through it a little bit more, because there's so much more to cover. But having said that, just to finish, there's lots and lots of good stuff out there, and, you know, just do a search for it, or information warfare, and, you know, see what comes up, and read about some of the tactics that are being used. And, you know, certainly the corporate world, you know, is astonishing in terms of particularly using predictive marketing and things like that, where you're using vast amounts of data to form predictive models of consumer behaviour. That's the cutting edge. Knowing what people are going to do before they've actually decided to do it. It's incredible.
Scary, I think. Yeah. Okay, Barrie, thank you so much. Truly appreciate your time and the information that you've shared with us. And I look forward to your book coming out.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Barrie. Good night.
Bye.